Economic growth in the second half should be a lot better. If we can get some resolution on trade, again, might be a little bit of a hit to Chinese sentiment, but over time, it gives businesses both in China and the U.S. more clarity on how and whether to invest in China. So that'll probably be a little bit of a bump for the Chinese economy, because right now a lot of companies have been wondering whether to base more of their operations in China. So we continue like emerging market equities. We think the Fed's pause. We think the ECB's pause. All of that stuff really factors in positively.
Well, what do you think the actual growth rate is in China these days?
It's always a little bit tough to tell, but we think it's around 6%. And, for the most part, we've been saying for some time that it will continue to slow. The law of large numbers suggests that as long as the growth is slower but more stable and higher quality, it's actually a good thing.
So you say that people can take the 25% rally. And granted, the market had been creamed in the couple of years before that. So Chinese stocks now up, let's call it 25, maybe 30% from the recent lows. You think that can continue? And what happens if Chinese investors start to pile in again? Because we know they've been subject to a lot of these boom-bust swings in recent years.
Yeah, no, so the point you made is probably the best one, is to try and keep it in perspective. EM has been underperforming for quite a few years now. So to the extent that, you can put some of these things behind you, probably the big reason behind the underperformance was Chinese reforms. If for the short term, they are putting those aside and they're actually stimulating their economy, I mean, that's going to be a big deal. That's really been the headwind that's kept them underperforming. So we think, at least right now, in the short term, that could lead to some outperformance. Now, you raised a great point as far as eventually that will lead back into some of the issues around debt levels being too high, but you've got to separate the short term from the long term.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's a better story in the short term than in the long term right now. But we'll see. They've got a tricky one to navigate. I wanted to ask if India as well, which has lost a lot of luster with international investors who loved it when Modi was first elected, but now even the U.S. is kind of distancing itself, expressing its displeasure with what's been happening there. U.S. companies like Amazon and Walmart have gotten singed. Do you think people are exiting that market and maybe going into China or some of these other areas?
It's possible. These things do tend to rotate, and they do come in and out of favor. I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, there was a lot of euphoria around Modi getting elected, and the problem with a lot of these things is expectations, just end up being too high, and they're just rarely, if ever, realized. And so you start to see geopolitical tensions start to rise with Pakistan. You start to see, tensions will also rise with China because they are on the side of Pakistan. So again, from a lot of those standpoints, it does seem like maybe we've reached kind of peak India as far as kind of the trade goes, if you will. So yeah, maybe there's a rotation back to China.
Well, let me ask you back here about the U.S. before I let you go. We had a similar phenomenon after Trump was elected. The markets were really on a tear, and we've since had a reset. What happens next? Can U.S. stocks continue to outperform? Do they need another catalyst? Is the kind of number like we got on the ISM services this morning something that could mean, hey, there's still a lot of room left?
We think outperformance versus EM is going to be tough, and a lot of that comes back to valuations. Emerging markets continue to be cheap on a relative basis versus U.S. equities. And so a lot of what's really good for U.S. companies will probably also, from this standpoint, also be good for emerging markets, because you really remove the biggest headwind, which was the Fed.